This map identifies popular insurrection movements in the Americas between the 1950s and the 1990s. And it also identifies very clearly those parts in Latin America that were sort of led, managed, ruled by right-wing military dictatorships in the late 1970s, but some of them already in the 50s all the way into the 1980s. The arrows also show the most overt and egregious cases of U.S. military interventions, be they directly or by proxy, in the Americas, and you'll see that Cuba is there, as is Central America, in which the United States is going to have sort of its last Cold War confrontation in the Americas in the 1980s all the way into the early 1990s, well past the sort of most vibrant and accurate times of the Cold War. This is a really useful map as we talk about revolutions and military regimes in the Americas, as you wrap your brain around the implications of the U.S. involvement or U.S. interest in Latin America and the way in which Latin American countries accommodated those interests. This map helps you have a sort of regional perspective over it. It can get kind of confusing sometimes, and I'd like you not to be confused. So avail yourselves of this map as much as possible. The Cold War strategy in Latin America, in what pertains to the relationship between Latin American countries and the United States, was entirely based on the threat of the spread of communism and armed rebellions. So the United States and different constituencies in Latin American countries would provide support for authoritarian and military regimes in order to prevent any type of communist threat and to prevent armed rebellions. This is important because the two will occasionally conflate. There might not be a threat of communism, but there'll be a threat of armed rebellion, which will be the same thing in terms of the military response in specific countries. And there's actually significant support from civil society for this kind of authoritarian response to any type of threat, be it of communism or of social disarray. And again, the two, communism and social instability or political instability, will very often overlap or be overlapped in a cognitive sense during this time period. And obviously, there's going to be significant financial and military support from the United States to, protect Latin America and the United States from becoming infected by communism. Now, what is the connection between military regimes in Latin America and U.S. foreign policy? Well, it's the Cold War. But there are actually more formal reasons why these two become connected. It's not just that, military regimes, Cold War plus communism equals a U.S. foreign policy that supports it. The Reciprocal Assistance Treaty and the Mutual Security Act of 1951 very clearly stated that the United States would ensure peace by all possible means, provide effective reciprocal aid to confront armed military attacks against any Latin American state, and prevent threats of aggression against any of them. Now, the threats that are being discussed here are threats of communist aggression. These are not threats of any other kind. But what it's also saying is that the United States will provide armed military responses and support when a Latin American country identifies a communist threat. So you can already imagine circumstances in which a Latin American state claims to have identified a threat of communist infiltration and uses the support of the United States to eliminate its political opponents, which may or may not be communist. The logic on the United States side was that communism was anti-democratic, and the United States was the example of the purest democracy, and capitalism is, in a sense, only possible in a democratic system. Therefore, if military regimes protect against communism, they must be good because they protect against communism and therefore make democracies possible, which make capitalism possible. This is a very simplified version of the logic, but it nevertheless touches on the simplest of truths, which is if you were an opponent of communism, you were a friend of democracy and a friend of the United States. These treaties in which the United States promises to come to the aid of any country that finds itself faced with the threat of communism is the dawn of the national security doctrine. This is the doctrine by which the United States would act on any foreign territory in order to protect its national security. And in Latin America, it has three distinct moments that we can identify as being directly connected to this. In 1964, the Brazilian military overthrows a democratic government, a democratic president, in order to impose order and rid the country of communist cancer. In 1973, the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende is also overthrown by a military dictator, or what would eventually become a military dictatorship. And the number of casualties that this dictatorship caused is difficult to establish. The numbers range from 8,000 to 30,000 dead between 1971 and 1988. And the reason why it's so difficult to have a accurate number is because so many of the bodies were never recovered. 1973 is also the beginning of the worst part of the Argentinian military order. That this military regimes are nothing new in Argentina in 1973, but certainly the most murderous, dirty wars, as it's known, was a military campaign that was aimed at also ridding Argentina of communist threat, but essentially was aimed at ridding Argentina of any form of dissent. And it did that by literally dismembering civil society and destroying any shred of democracy that Argentina had ever shown. And some have argued that it still has not recovered from it. The coup against Salvador Allende is, I think without a doubt, I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say that this is probably the worst outcome of the alliance between military interests, civilian anti-communism and fears, and U.S. foreign policy. The story goes like this. In 1970, Salvador Allende won an election, not by a landslide, but he won the election, and he was elected president. He was the first socialist president of Chile, overtly socialist. He was also the first socialist who was elected democratically. He did not lead a revolution. He did not take the presidency with weapons. He was elected. This, of course, meant that he was a Democrat and a socialist, which ran counter to the logic that established by the United States and by most military regimes, which was that communism was anti-democratic and therefore it was bad. In this case, you had a socialist president who was a Marxist. He was not explicitly a communist. And in fact, he lost the support of the Communist Party during his presidency because he was not radical enough. But nonetheless, to the United States and to many in Chile, he was unacceptable. And he nationalized the mining industry. He had wage reforms, labor and education reforms that were all met with loud opposition from the Chilean middle class and by industrialists. And with support from the United States, by covert means, they managed to destabilize the Chilean economy, the Chilean political system. And by 1973, the economy was in almost standstill. Every major industry was striking. And Allende had lost the support of his core constituency. He had lost the support of some of his allies on the political spectrum, and on September 11th, 1973, the alternative, the military, staged a coup d'etat to impose order again and in a sense stabilize the country, but then also never left power until the 1980s. There was enormous domestic support for this overthrow, but this does not happen without the cooperation and the support of the United States. It is a stain on Chile's history, both the participation of the United States, but perhaps most partly because such a large number of people supported a coup by the military that would then become a military dictatorship that cost so many Chileans their lives. The reason why the military so often become involved during this period is because there's a traditional alliance between military regimes and order. The military will sort of be ushered into action when there's a threat of instability and social upheaval, in the sense that when social upheaval threatens the institutions of order and government, the military will step in and stabilize it so that government can function. The big shift here is that, as we saw in Brazil, the military no longer just stabilizes the country so that the governmental institutions can operate as they should. The military becomes the political institution, right? The democratic institutions, in a sense, become servants to the military interests and servants to the military ideology that is essentially driven to control the entire country and protect from communist infiltration. A less nefarious, but just as controlling aspect, the connection between economic inequality and stability had already been identified in policies of John F. Kennedy. And so there were economic programs that were aimed at preventing social unrest, but these were obviously much less important than the military and financial support to more oppressive means of control. So who supports the military? Well, disturbingly, there's enormous domestic local support for these military coups. In Brazil, civil society was deeply participating in neighborhood watches for the military to identify potential threats or neighbors who just didn't behave well. So there's an enormous part of social control involved in this. The domestic support for the military coup in Chile, I've already discussed that. And in Argentina, there was also domestic support for the establishment of order, but because the military regime was not something particularly new when it became such a violent entity, there was also very strong civilian reaction against that violence. The disappearance of young students, that is the darkest time, the Dirty War, led to not civil disobedience, but civil responses, peaceful responses that didn't disarm the military power or the military regime, but it certainly made a dent in the argument that it was there with the support of the entire civilian population. The term subversive is very often used during the Cold War, and it's used by the United States and by anti-communists to identify people who were avowed communists or were suspected of being communists. But essentially, subversive is anyone who questions authority, who questions government policy, who acts and leads acts against the state. They're subversive. They are meant to subvert the goals of the ruling power. These are subversives by that standard. The demonstrating students holding signs of make love, not war. Bishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who argued that the role of the church was to help the poor, not to collude with government in marginalizing them. His argument, which is part of the theology of liberation, very much sees the message of Christ as the goal, the ideal of what the church should do, helping the poor, not helping to sustain the status quo. Under the definitions of what a subversive is, Jesus Christ, hippies who were peace-loving, and the Bishop of El Salvador would be considered subversives. Lucio Cabañas would obviously also be considered a subversive in this context. Anybody who opposed excessive government power would qualify as a subversive. And it's important to realize that subversives also existed in countries that did not have military regimes. Mexico was not a military dictatorship, not ever during the 20th century. But it did have an extremely strong one-party state. And there was opposition to it. And it was armed guerrilla opposition. that reacted against the excessive state control in Mexico. And Lucio Cabañas is probably one of the best known guerrilla leaders. He was a rural school teacher who took arms and led different guerrilla movements in the state of Guerrero against this oppressive power of the state in Mexico. He was not successful in overthrowing the government, but he was very successful at creating a tradition in Mexico of armed and vociferous and proud opposition to a government that speaks as if it supported the people, especially in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, but that in fact does not. There's a connection between Lucio Cabañas and the middle of the 1990s Zapatista rebellion, but we'll get to that in another lecture. In Peru, the excessive power of the government is faced, or at least is responded to, by Maoist revolutions. The Peruvian Communist Party is not a party that participates in the politics, but is a armed guerrilla movement. And what you see here is a poster for the Communist Party of Peru that clearly identifies the armed nature of their opposition. The sign says 5 years of popular war, and every person, except for the tallest one with the glasses, who is holding a flag with a hammer and sickle, which are the symbols of communism, everybody else is holding a weapon in this poster. Now, what about the Catholic Church? What were they doing during all this time? Well, the official church policy was to remain neutral. And more often than not, the Catholic Church sided with the military regimes because the Catholic Church does not like social unrest, because communism is a political system that does not support religion or doesn't believe in religion, and so inherently was threatening to the Catholic Church. But there was a movement within the Church, the theology of liberation, which argued that Jesus Christ's teachings needed to be used to protect the poor, that the greed demonstrated by governments and by companies and corporations and industrialists was sin, and that the poverty was the product of other people's sin that the Church, in fact, should act against. So the painting that you see here is an image of Jesus Christ, and on the back you see him he has a rifle slung over his shoulder. That, in a nutshell, theology of liberation, and you can imagine why there might have been some problems with more traditional church members accepting it, or why governments, especially military regimes, would consider the theology of liberation to be one more evidence of the spread of the cancerous communism. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the term subversive comes to mean, well, the exact same thing, just applied in a different context. If you dare say anything against Castro or against the Cuban Revolution, against the Soviet Union, against Che Guevara, you're considered a subversive. If you suggest that there might be some improvements in the current political system, or that the current political system deserves some changes in process, you will be considered a subversive. If you're gay, you're most likely subversive in Cuba. If you're a drug addict, you're definitely a subversive. So essentially, the threat of overthrow and the obsessiveness with protecting state power is not just the purview of the military regimes. And there's reaction against the excess of abusive power that these regimes demonstrate. As I mentioned, in Argentina, civil society will respond to the brutal military repression. And these are the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the mothers of students who had been tortured and disappeared, whose bodies were never found. The mothers would meet once a week on the Plaza de Mayo in central Buenos Aires in Argentina and just walk in a circle holding a photograph of their children, of their lost child, as a means to demonstrate that they would always be there waiting for the government to tell them what had happened to their children. This is a really, really powerful means of peaceful opposition. The response to Cuba's oppressive regime, or the exodus of the Marianitos exodus of thousands of Cubans who pressured the government finally forcing the government to allow them to emigrate to the United States. And then there's the U.S. Congress, who also, being informed of the excess of these governments' power and abuse of its citizens, and recognizing how much money the United States was sending that way, started to really oppose the flow of dollars to dictators. And then non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International making more and more noise and news about the human rights abuses in countries that the United States had been supporting. And obviously, this is not a reaction against the excess, but all of this ends when the USSR stops being. When the Soviet Union crumbles, the Cold War ends. And once the Cold War ends, so do the authoritarian regimes. This graph identifies very clearly that relationship. The Cold War ends in the late 1980s. The Berlin Wall falls. The USSR becomes a sort of democratic country, but certainly no longer a communist regime. The United States stops supporting military regimes in Latin America and elsewhere. And if you look at the graphs here, the blue line is the number of democracies. So number of countries is the number of countries are on the y-axis, and the x-axis is time. The number of countries that have democracies is on a steady rise since the early 19th century. The number of countries that have autocracies, it's a little bit all over the place until the 1940s. Then there's an extremely sharp rise during the Cold War. From 1950 all the way until the middle of the 1970s, early 1980s, there were a significant number of countries that were autocracies. Now, they're not all military autocracies, but they're certainly autocracies. And all of a sudden, starting in the late 1980s and really clearly in 1990, the number of autocracies just drops. Democracies continue their rise. Autocracies continue their fall. And then there's this strange term of anocracies, which are neither democratic nor autocratic countries. They're unstable, and they're often considered to be political systems in transition. Well, they're in transition, but they're certainly not a majority. If you look at the time period during which Latin America was sort of the immediate post-independence area, the early 1900 all the way until 19th century all the way until the 1930s, you see a significant number of countries that were in transition. These were all the ex-colonial countries trying to stabilize the political systems and ultimately becoming democracies. The black line becomes a blue line, and that is good news. And the red line becomes a blue line, and that's even better news.